Today's sponsor is the maker of the best wallets in the world, the Ridge. Do you know someone who uses one of those boring leather wallets? Why not surprise them this holiday by giving them something cool, unique, and practical like a Ridge wallet? The Ridge has dozens of designs, so you're bound to find a special one for everyone on your gift list. The wallets come in titanium, carbon fiber, and aluminum. The material makes them strong and durable, and the Ridge backs them up with a lifetime warranty. They are also safer than traditional wallets because they have RFID blocking. The wallets are also incredibly practical. They hold up to 12 cards plus your cash. It's not surprising to me that they have over 30,000 five-star reviews. Currently, the Ridge is offering criminally listed viewers 10% off with free worldwide shipping and returns. Just go to ridge.com/listed, that's ridge.com/listed, and use the promo code listed at the checkout. Buy someone special the last wallet they'll ever need and help support Criminally Listed in the process by checking out ridge.com/listed. Number 3. Yaser Abdel Saeed. In May 2020, in the video 3 Murder Suspects Who Vanished into Thin Air Part 3, we cover the case of Yaser Abdel Saeed. Yaser was born in Egypt in 1957 and he moved to Dallas, Texas in 1983 with his mother, brother, and sister. Yaser worked menial jobs in the United States. He usually worked at convenience stores and drove taxis, but he rarely stayed at one job for very long. In February 1987, 30-year-old Yaser married 15-year-old Patricia Owens. They had known each other for about a week. Patricia became pregnant not long after they were wed. She gave birth to a son named Islam in 1987. In 1989, Patricia gave birth to a daughter, Amina, and then the next year she had another daughter, Sarah. Yaser was an abusive and controlling husband and father. In October 1998, Amina and Sarah, who were 9 and 8 respectively, told their maternal grandmother something shocking. They said that for the past 2 or 3 years, their father had been sexually abusing them. The grandmother told Patricia what the girls told her. Patricia reported the accusations to the police and she left Yaser. Yaser was charged with aggravated sexual assault. But the charges were dropped months later when Patricia told the police that the girls had made up the allegations. She said that they had lied because they wanted to live with their grandmother. There was no stability in Yaser and Patricia's household. Patricia had dropped out of high school, so she had problems finding work. Yaser could rarely hold down jobs because of his erratic behavior. So the family moved around a lot. Yaser also continued to abuse his family. Several times after Yaser's assaults, Amina and Sarah probably should have received medical treatment, but they didn't. Patricia convinced them not to go to the hospital because she was worried that Yaser would get in trouble. When Amina and Sarah were in their teens, Yaser started to make plans to sell his daughters off into marriage. Amina and Sarah had no desire to get married to the men their father wanted them to marry. In late 2007, they had their own boyfriends. On Christmas Eve 2007, Yaser found out about the boyfriends and he snapped. That evening, Patricia was working at a grocery store. Amina and Sarah came into the store and they were panicking. They were sure that their father was going to kill them. The next day, Patricia, Amina, and Sarah and their 2 boyfriends fled the state. They ended up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where they rented an apartment. But it wasn't a clean break from Yaser because Patricia had remained in contact with him. Yaser convinced Patricia to come back to Texas with the girls. Patricia told Amina and Sarah that she wanted to put flowers on her mother's grave in East Texas. Amina and Sarah may not have known that Patricia had been estranged from her mother years before her death. They had stopped talking after Patricia went back to Yaser after the girls accused him of sexual abuse. On New Year's Eve, they drove back to Texas. The next day, Amina and Sarah reluctantly agreed to meet with her father. Yaser picked up 18-year-old Amina and 17-year-old Sarah in his taxi. At 7:35 p.m. on New Year's Day, the following call came into 911 in Irving, Texas.
Irving 911, what is your emergency? What's going on, ma'am?
I'm dying, that's what's up. Oh my God. Stop it.
The 911 dispatcher started an urgent search for the caller. About an hour after the call, a taxi driver who was parked in a hotel's taxi queue in Irving called 911. He explained that he had been in the taxi queue and the taxi in front of him did not move up when it was his turn to. He went to investigate and he saw that no one was in the driver's seat. In the front seat and the back seat, it was the dead bodies of two young women. The police came to the hotel and they confirmed that the bodies were 18-year-old Amina and 17-year-old Sarah. Based on data collected from cell phone towers, the police believe that the sisters were killed near a firing range in Irving. Yaser shot his daughter Amina twice at point-blank range. He then turned the gun on Sarah. She was able to call 911, but her father continued to shoot her. In total, she was shot 9 times. It's believed that Yaser went to the area near the firing range to cover up the sounds of the gunshots. After murdering his 2 daughters, he dropped the taxi off in the taxi queue at the hotel. Then, 50-year-old Yaser Abdel Saeed vanished. The authorities had no idea where he fled to. He had an Egyptian passport, so they thought he may have gone back to the country of his birth. But they couldn't find any records of him boarding a flight to Egypt. In December 2014, 6 years after the murders, Yaser was added to the FBI's 10 Most Wanted list. The FBI thought he could have gone to New York, Virginia, or Canada. Or he may have just stayed in Texas. The FBI got a promising lead about Yaser's whereabouts in August 2017. A maintenance man had been called to the apartment of Yaser's son, 29-year-old Islam. At the time, Islam was living in Bedford, Texas. The maintenance man saw Yaser in the apartment and he knew he was a wanted man. The maintenance man talked to the manager of the apartment building and they contacted the FBI. Agents came to the apartment and asked Islam if they could look around. Islam refused to let them in. According to the phone records, Islam then called his uncle, Yasin, and told him they had a problem. The FBI agents returned a few hours later with a warrant. They pounded on the door of the apartment, but no one answered, so they breached the door. No one was inside the apartment. They found evidence that someone had jumped from the balcony at the back of the building into some bushes. The FBI agents found some cigarette butts and a toothbrush in the apartment. DNA samples were taken from the items, and it was determined that was Yaser's DNA. So the FBI knew that Yaser Saeed was alive and he was in contact with his family. 3 years later, and about 2 months after our video with the segment about Yaser went live, the FBI started watching a house in Justin, Texas. The house had been purchased by Yaser's niece. She is the daughter of Yaser's brother, Yasin. On August 19, 2020, 2 days after they started watching the house, the police saw Islam and Yasin arrive with groceries. They left a short time later, empty-handed. That night, the house should have been empty, but the agents watching the house saw a shadow of a person pass by a window twice. On August 25th, Islam and Yasin returned to the house. They took 2 garbage bags from the house and drove them to a shopping center in a different town that was 19 miles away. They threw the trash bags into a dumpster. The FBI picked up the trash bags, and inside, they found items that had DNA on them. The FBI determined it was Yaser's DNA. They got a warrant, and on August 26, 2020, Yaser Abdel Saeed was arrested after 12.5 years on the lam. Later that same day, Islam and Yasin were arrested. All 3 are being held in custody, and no trial dates are set. After her former husband was captured, Amin and Sarah's mother, Patricia Owens, said, "Now the girls can rest in peace." Number 2. Sabina Long. In our July 2017 video, 3 Unsolved Cases of Stalking Part 2, we cover the case of Sabina Long. 19-year-old Sabina disappeared not far from her Macon, Georgia home on August 14, 1991. Shortly after the video went live, we were contacted by Sabrina's sister, Melissa Long. She informed us that there were several inaccuracies in the segment. Unfortunately, some of the sources we used to write the segment had false information. So this is a more accurate description of the case. In the summer of 1991, Sabina Long was 19 years old. She liked V.C. Andrews' books and horseback riding. That summer, Sabina was living with her stepfather. Sabrina's mother, Sue Corley, and her stepfather had split up over a year earlier in June 1990. Sabrina and her mother loved each other deeply, but, like some mothers and daughters do, they butted heads. So Sabrina was living with her former stepfather. Sabrina had dreams of being a model, but she would have also been happy being an English teacher. In the summer of 1991, Sabrina was working at a local textile plant. She cut labels for linen products. On August 13, 1991, Sabrina worked a double shift and finished work at 11 p.m. At the time, her vehicle wasn't working. That day, she drove her boyfriend's car to work. After work, she drove to the house where her boyfriend was staying. He drove her to her home and dropped her off. When he dropped her off, no one else was home. That night, Sabrina wrote a love letter to her boyfriend. She wrote about upcoming plans, including making dinner for him. Sometime between 12:30 and 1:30, Sabrina called her mother, Sue Corley. Sue was sleeping, but she woke up for the call. They talked for a few minutes, and then Sabrina said she was going over to a neighbor's home. That neighbor was a young man named Keith Lloyd. He and Sabrina had attended high school together. It's believed that Lloyd had called Sabrina and told her he had purchased a gift for his mother that she should come over and check out. Sabrina asked her mother to call her back in 30 minutes. Sue had already been asleep when Sabrina called. Sue got no sense that anything was wrong with her daughter. She told Sabrina that she would most likely be asleep, but they would talk soon. Then the mother and daughter hung up. Sabrina's stepfather got home a few hours later, around 3 a.m. He had been out visiting a friend. The house was locked up when he got home. He assumed that Sabrina was in bed. The next day, Sabrina did not show up for work. This was odd because it was not like her to miss a shift without calling in first. Her family became more alarmed when they found out that she didn't pick up her paycheck. They reasoned that if Sabrina wanted to run away, she would have at least picked up her last paycheck. Also, besides her keys, nothing else was missing. In Sabrina's room, they found the letter that she had written to her boyfriend on the night she went missing. In the letter, Sabrina wrote she is looking forward to some upcoming events. The tone of the letter was not someone who was planning on running away. So Sabina Long was reported missing. The police talked to Keith Lloyd, who they thought may have been the last person to see Sabrina before she went missing. Lloyd told the police that he was surprised to hear that Sabrina had planned on coming to his house that night. He claimed he had not invited her over. He said that on the night Sabrina went missing, he was at a bar with his girlfriend. He said he got home around 1 or 1:30 a.m. and he did not see Sabrina that night. The police learned that before Sabrina went missing, she and her family received several strange phone calls. One caller was a man, and he would call in the middle of the night. He would ask Sabrina things like, "Are you dating anyone? Would you go out with me?" Sabrina was a friendly and open person, so she would carry on conversations with the man. The week before Sabrina went missing, her sister, Melissa, got a phone call from a man. He said he was from a local company that Sabrina had applied to work at. He told Melissa that Sabrina had a job interview. Melissa thought that the call was odd. Notably, the man called on a Sunday instead of a weekday. Also, she could hear children playing in the background. Melissa asked for the man's name, which caught him off guard. He hesitated, and then he said his name was Mr. Thomas. Melissa told her sister about the phone call. She told Sabrina to call the company in the morning, and if she were to go to the interview, she should bring her gun. Sabrina called the company and found out that no one with the last name Thomas worked in the department and no one was conducting interviews at that time. The strange phone calls have never been linked to Sabrina's disappearance. For years, Sabrina's family suffered daily from not knowing what happened to her. Melissa said that their mother, Sue Corley, took it the hardest. Many people in Sabrina's family suspected that her stepfather was responsible for her disappearance. They hired a private investigator and they checked out the yard where Sabrina lived with her stepfather. He noticed that under the deck, which Sabrina's stepfather built around the time of her disappearance, that some dirt had settled oddly. The private investigator thought a large hole had been dug there at some point. However, Sabrina's family couldn't dig under the deck because the property's new owner wouldn't allow them to dig. 27 long years went by, and Sabina Long's family still had no idea what happened to her. Melissa Long said that dealing with Sabrina's disappearance never got easier. It was just something they learned to live with. Then in October 2018, the Georgia Bureau of Investigation announced that they had made an arrest in the case. They had arrested a 46-year-old motel housekeeper named Melinda McSwain. McSwain had been a classmate of Sabrina's. When Sabrina went missing, McSwain was 19 years old. Sabrina's family said that they didn't know McSwain. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation wouldn't explain what led to McSwain's arrest. All they said was that they had conducted some interviews and executed several search warrants. They also did not announce anything about the location of Sabrina's remains. In January 2019, McSwain was indicted for felony murder, malice murder, and kidnapping with bodily harm. The prosecution alleged that McSwain kidnapped and held Sabrina against her will, and this resulted in her death. A month after McSwain was indicted, there was a bond hearing and more revelations were made. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation was sure that at least one other person was involved in the kidnapping and murder of Sabina Long. But he had died on September 25, 2017. He had been struck by a freight train in downtown Macon, Georgia. His death was ruled as suicide. The man's name was Keith Lloyd. Lloyd was the neighbor that Sabrina was going to see on the night she went missing. Lloyd originally told the police that he did not invite Sabrina over that night and he did not see her. Melinda McSwain's lawyer said that Keith Lloyd left a suicide note. The lawyer speculated that in the note, Lloyd implicated McSwain in Sabrina's murder. Supposedly, the police found letters written by Lloyd to Sabrina that indicated that he had feelings for her. But there is no indication that Sabrina reciprocated his feelings. Sadly, even though charges have been made in the case, Sabrina's family still doesn't know what happened to her or where she is. No trial date has been set for Melinda McSwain. Melissa Long said that her family is happy, but points out there are still many unanswered questions. Also, the arrest doesn't heal the pain of having Sabrina gone from their lives. Melissa notes that she has 2 sons, and they'll never be able to meet their aunt. The case is currently open, and the investigation is ongoing. Number 1. Christine Jessop. Queensville is a small village in Ontario, Canada that is about 40 miles from downtown Toronto. In 1984, it was home to the Jessop family. Bob and Janet Jessop had tried to conceive for years, but they were not able to. They adopted a boy, Ken, in 1969. 5 years later, against all odds, Janet discovered she was pregnant. The birth was difficult, and the hospital staff wasn't sure if Janet or the baby would survive. Amazingly, Christine Jessop was born on November 29, 1974. Janet also survived the birth. Bob and Janet thought of Christine as their miracle child. When Christine was born, she was underweight. She was a sickly baby who was in and out of the hospital during her early life. A few times she was close to death. By the time she was 8 years old, her health had improved, but she was smaller than many children her age. On October 3, 1984, 9-year-old Christine Jessop attended school. That day, all the kids in her class were given recorders. That afternoon, the school bus dropped her off at home. No one was home when Christine got off the bus. Her father, Bob, was on a business trip in California. Her mother, Janet, who worked at Sears, was usually home in time to get Christine off the bus. But that afternoon, she took Ken to the dentist's office. Christine got inside the family's home and dropped off the mail. She then rode her bike to a nearby store where she purchased some gum. Christine was supposed to meet her friend at the neighborhood park, but she never arrived there. Her friend called the Jessop home at 4 p.m. and no one answered the phone. 10 minutes later, Janet and Ken arrived home and they found Christine's bike on the ground. They looked around the neighborhood for her, but they couldn't find her. She was reported missing and the village was searched. But sadly, no trace of 9-year-old Christine Jessop was found. About 2 months after Christine went missing, it would have been her 10th birthday. Her family still didn't know what had happened to her. On New Year's Eve 1984, whatever hope the Jessop family had that Christine would be returned to them alive was dashed. Christine's body was found in a farmer's field about 35 miles from her home. She had been missing for 3 months. The body was severely decomposed. The medical examiner determined she had been sexually assaulted, beaten, and stabbed multiple times. About a month after the body was found, the police had a prime suspect, 23-year-old Guy Paul Moran. Guy Paul lived with his parents in the house next door to the Jessops. The police thought that Guy Paul and his family acted strangely when Christine went missing. For example, Guy Paul refused to give his phone number to the police because he said it was private. Guy Paul didn't help search for Christine, nor did he attend her funeral. A dog was brought to help search for Christine hours after she was reported missing. The dog indicated it smelled traces of Christine on Guy Paul's Honda and on his family's property. The police asked Guy Paul's father, Alphonse Moran, if they could search his home. Alphonse said that he and his family had looked around their house and Christine wasn't there, so the police didn't need to come inside. On February 22nd, 2 detectives interviewed Guy Paul. They thought he said some incriminating things. For example, they alleged he said, "All little girls are sweet and beautiful, but grow up to be corrupt." Guy Paul was a musician, and he mentioned to the detectives that he heard that Christine was learning to play the recorder when she went missing. After the interview, the detectives developed a theory about what happened to Christine on the day she vanished. The detectives thought that Guy Paul saw Christine with her recorder. They thought that Guy Paul used music as a way to engage her in conversation. He got her into his car, then sexually assaulted her and killed her, and then dumped the body. But there was a major problem with the theory that Guy Paul killed Christine. He had an alibi. At the time of the murder, Guy Paul worked as a finishing sander at a furniture manufacturing plant just north of Toronto. His place of employment was 35.4 miles from his home. The police got Guy Paul's time card for the day that Christine went missing. He punched out at 3:32 p.m. If he made no stops along the way, the earliest he could have been home was 4:14 p.m. By then, Janet and Ken were home and had discovered Christine was missing. Ken knew what time they arrived home because he had a new watch and he looked at it after they got home and he remembered it being 4:10. Guy Paul did make some stops on the way home from work. In a town on the way to Queensville, he stopped off at a mall and bought some lottery tickets. He also went to 2 grocery stores. He arrived home at about 5:30 p.m. His parents, his sister, and his brother-in-law were there when he got home. The detectives talked to Guy Paul's family, and they confirmed he arrived home at 5:30 with grocery bags. Guy Paul had a half an hour nap, then he had dinner, and then at about 7 p.m., he started helping his father with renovations on their home. The detectives questioned Janet and Ken again and pressured them to rethink their timeline. Janet said they could have been mistaken and they could have arrived home at 4:30 or later. The detectives thought that if they arrived home at 4:30, the Guy Paul would have had enough time to leave work, come directly home, and kidnap Christine. Nevertheless, the police arrested Guy Paul Moran on April 22, 1985, 7 months after Christine was kidnapped. His car was searched, and some hairs were found inside of it. Tests were conducted, and the investigators thought they were Christine's hairs. They thought that fibers and animal hairs that were found in the car were similar to fibers and animal hairs that were found where Christine's body was found. Finally, 3 hairs were found in the necklace Christine was wearing. After comparing the hairs to Guy Paul's hair, an expert said that the hairs in the necklace belonged to Guy Paul. Guy Paul Moran went to trial in October 1985. The fibers and the hairs were presented as evidence. Also, 2 jailhouse informants testified. One of the men had been in a jail cell with Guy Paul while he was awaiting trial, and the other was in a neighboring cell. They claimed that Guy Paul confessed to the murder. They testified in exchange for leniency in their own cases. The trial was about 4 weeks long. The jury found Guy Paul Moran not guilty. Then, the prosecution appealed the conviction. They said that the judge gave improper instructions to the jury regarding reasonable doubt. The Court of Appeals agreed, and the acquittal was reversed. Guy Paul Moran went to trial again in the fall of 1991. 120 witnesses were called. The trial lasted for 9 months, making it one of the longest court cases for murder in Canadian history. The jury deliberated for 7 days. On July 30th, 1992, Guy Paul was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life with a chance of parole after 25 years. Guy Paul's lawyers appealed the conviction. About 6 months after Guy Paul was convicted, he was granted bond while he awaited the outcome of his appeal. Previously, DNA testing had been done on semen stains found in Christine Jessop's underwear, but because of the limitations of DNA technology at the time, they were never able to create a profile. The stains were tested again after Guy Paul's lawyers filed an appeal. Days before his lawyers were to argue his appeal, the results for the DNA test came back. It was determined that it was not Guy Paul Moran's DNA. So the charges against him were dropped. In January 1997, Guy Paul Moran was awarded $1.25 million in compensation. After he was exonerated, he got married and his wife gave birth to 2 sons. The murder of Christine Jessop and the miscarriage of justice experienced by Guy Paul Moran made the case one of the most infamous murder cases in Canadian history. But for decades, the case sat cold. Then, on October 9, 2020, the police announced that, after 36 years, the case had been solved thanks to forensic genealogy. It was the first time the process was used in Canada to identify a killer. Christine's killer was a man named Calvin Hooper, who was 28 years old at the time of the murder. His wife had worked with Christine's father, Bob. Hoover and his wife had 2 children, and sometimes their children would play with Ken and Christine. The Hoover family lived in Toronto, and it's not clear why Hoover was in Queensville on the day of the murder. Years after the murder, Hoover and his wife got divorced. Hoover remarried in 2004 and his wife died in 2009. In 2015, Hoover was living in Port Hope, Ontario with his son. One day, while his son was away, Hoover, who was in his late 50s, hanged himself in the garage. Hoover did have a criminal record, but it was for nothing violent. He was arrested once for driving under the influence in April 1996. Hoover had not been considered a suspect until his DNA was linked to the murder through forensic genealogy. After Hoover was identified as Christine's killer, the police began investigating his whereabouts over the past 4 decades. The police also received a flood of tips regarding Hoover. The police think that Calvin Hoover may have been responsible for other murders, and they said that this was just the start of their investigation. A foundation for the wrongly accused and the Jessop family have asked for an independent review of the police regarding how Hoover could have been missed as a suspect. In a statement, Paul Moran said he is relieved that the killer was finally identified, and he hopes it gives the Jessop family some peace. Ken Jessop said that his family did get some relief, but they are angry to find out that Calvin Hoover, who was at Christine's wake and funeral, was the person who killed her. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Recently, we launched a podcast called Into the Killing. In each episode, we examine a cold case that was solved years later. In our latest episode, we take a look at the haunting murder of a young girl and a tragic miscarriage of justice. Into the Killing is available on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and anywhere you find your favorite podcasts. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.